My son convinced me to sign power of attorney, then immediately sold my house because I was too frail to live independently. The $3.2 million mansion I purchased with my secret inheritance taught him that frailty and poverty are two very different things. The document looked innocent enough, just 3 pages of legal language that David assured me was standard paperwork for estate planning. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped him with homework 40 years earlier, trusting my son to guide me through what he called important financial protections for your future. "Mom, this power of attorney is just a safety measure," he explained, pointing to the signature line with the confidence of someone who had clearly researched this moment thoroughly. "It means that if anything happens to you, if you get sick or confused, I can handle your finances and make sure your bills get paid." At 78, I had been managing my own finances successfully for 6 decades, but I understood that David was concerned about my future well-being. What I didn't understand was that he had already decided my current well-being was insufficient and required immediate intervention. "Will this document let you make decisions about my house?" I asked, though I was already reaching for the pen. "Only if it becomes necessary, Mom. Only if you're unable to make good decisions for yourself." Unable to make good decisions for myself. The phrase should have been a warning, but it was delivered with such gentle concern that I interpreted it as love rather than condescension. I signed the document, trusting that my son would use this legal authority only in genuine emergencies and only with my best interests at heart. But what I didn't know was that David had already scheduled the emergency. 3 days later, he arrived at my house with a real estate agent, a moving company estimate, and a brochure for Sunset Gardens assisted living. The conversation that followed revealed that my signature on the power of attorney had been the final step in a plan he'd been developing for months. "Mom, I've been thinking about your living situation, and I believe it's time to make some changes." "What kind of changes?" "This house is too big for you to maintain properly. The yard work, the upkeep, the utilities, it's all becoming too much for someone your age." Someone my age. I was 78, not dead, and I had been maintaining my house and yard successfully, with the help of a cleaning service and a gardener that I paid for with my own money. "David, I'm managing just fine." "Mom, you're being stubborn about this. Last week I noticed that the gutters need cleaning, and the front steps could use some repair work. These aren't things you can handle yourself anymore." The gutters needed cleaning because it was autumn, and the steps needed minor repairs that I had already scheduled with a contractor. But David was presenting normal homeownership maintenance as evidence of my incompetence. "I have people who help me with maintenance, sweetheart. That's what happens when you can afford to hire professionals." "But that's exactly the problem, Mom. You're spending money on house maintenance that could be better used for your care and security. Sunset Gardens would handle all of this for you." But what he said next was what revealed the true scope of his plan. "I've already had the house appraised, and we can get $450,000 for it. After paying off the remaining mortgage and covering your moving expenses, that should give you about $370,000 for your care." Already had the house appraised. He had been planning to sell my house before he'd even asked me to sign the power of attorney. "David, I never agreed to sell my house." "Mom, that's why we signed the power of attorney. You don't have to agree to decisions that are clearly in your best interest. I can make those decisions for you now." The legal document I had signed as a safety measure for emergencies had become the tool for eliminating my autonomy entirely. "And what if I don't want to move to assisted living?" "Mom, you don't really have a choice anymore. This house is too much for you, and Sunset Gardens will provide the care and supervision you need." Care and supervision. As if I were a child who needed to be managed rather than an adult who had been living independently and successfully for 78 years. "David, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I signed that document because you said it was for emergencies, not because I wanted you to make major life decisions for me." "Mom, your inability to recognize that you need help is the emergency. That's exactly why this document was necessary." The circular logic was perfect. I needed to be managed because I didn't want to be managed. My resistance to his control was evidence that control was necessary. But what David didn't know was that his assessment of my finances was as flawed as his assessment of my competence. The little old lady who was apparently too frail to live independently had been quietly accumulating wealth for decades through investments, inheritance, and careful financial planning that she had never felt compelled to discuss with her children. The $370,000 David was planning to extract from selling my house represented about 8% of my actual net worth. and the assisted living he was planning for my future was about to become the launching pad for the most satisfying real estate purchase of my life. The house sold faster than David had anticipated, largely because he had priced it to move quickly rather than to maximize my return on a lifetime of homeownership. Within 2 weeks of listing, we had a cash offer that he accepted immediately, despite my request to consider other potential buyers who might offer better terms. "Mom, this is a good offer, and we shouldn't risk losing it by being greedy. The important thing is to get you settled in your new living situation as quickly as possible. Not being greedy with my money, while making major financial decisions that would affect the rest of my life without consulting me about my preferences or priorities." But what bothered me most was the speed with which David was moving, as if my transition from independent homeowner to managed care resident was an urgent crisis that required immediate action. "David, what's the rush? Sunset Gardens isn't going anywhere. Mom, the sooner we get you settled, the sooner you can start adjusting to your new life. Change is hard at your age, so it's better to move quickly rather than prolonging the transition." Change is hard at your age. Another assumption about my diminished capacity to adapt, despite evidence that I had been adapting successfully to changes throughout my life. The closing was scheduled for the following Friday, with my move to Sunset Gardens planned for the following Monday. David had orchestrated the timing to minimize what he called my opportunity to second-guess decisions that are clearly in your best interest. But what he didn't anticipate was my own weekend plans. On Saturday morning, while David was congratulating himself on efficiently managing my transition to dependency, I was meeting with Margaret Chen, the estate planning attorney who had been managing my investments for the past 15 years. "Betty, I have to say, I'm surprised by your son's decision to sell your house so quickly. Based on our conversations, I understood that you were comfortable living independently." "I was comfortable, Margaret. But David seems to think I'm no longer competent to make my own decisions." "And how do you feel about moving to assisted living?" "I feel like I'm being managed rather than cared for. And I've decided that if David thinks I need a change of housing, he's probably right, just not the change he has in mind." Margaret smiled with the expression of someone who had helped many clients navigate family disputes about autonomy and competence. "What did you have in mind?" "I want to buy a house, Margaret. A really nice house. Something that will demonstrate that frailty and poverty are two very different things." "Do you have a particular property in mind?" "Actually, I do. The Whitmore estate on Hillcrest Avenue has been for sale for 6 months. David has driven past it countless times, pointing out how much he admires the architecture and the gardens." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. "Betty, the Whitmore estate is listed at $3.2 million. I'm aware of the price, Margaret. Can I afford it? Based on your current portfolio, you could buy it with cash and still have substantial assets remaining. But are you sure this is the right response to your son's concerns about your housing situation?" "Margaret, my son sold my house because he assumed I was too frail to live independently and too poor to afford proper care. I'm going to prove that both assumptions were incorrect." But what Margaret said next was what made my plan even more satisfying. "Betty, there's something you should know about the Whitmore estate. It's been on the market for 6 months because the asking price is above current market values. If you're willing to pay the full asking price, the sellers would probably accept an immediate cash offer." "How quickly could we close? With cash and no financing contingencies?" "Probably within 2 weeks." "Perfect. I want to own that house before David finishes congratulating himself on managing my finances so efficiently." Margaret prepared the offer that afternoon. By Sunday evening, I had a signed purchase agreement for the most expensive house in the county. By the following Friday, the same day my old house closed, I was the owner of a 12-room mansion with formal gardens, a 3-car garage, and a market value that exceeded David's annual salary by a factor of 10. But the most important aspect of my new home wasn't its size or value, it was its location. The Whitmore estate was exactly 3 blocks from David's house, in the same exclusive neighborhood where he had always dreamed of living, but could never afford. Every time he drove to work, he would pass the house he had admired for years, now owned by the frail mother he had just forced into assisted living. On Monday morning, instead of moving into Sunset Gardens as David had planned, I was moving into the most luxurious house in the city. And I was planning a housewarming party that would teach my son exactly what happens when you assume your mother is too old and poor to make her own decisions. The woman he thought was too frail to live independently was about to become his wealthiest neighbor, and the financial competence he had questioned was about to be displayed in a way that would make his own successful management of my affairs look like amateur hour. But what David didn't know yet was that his mother's assisted living was going to involve a staff of 3, a professional landscaping service, and a social calendar that would make his own retirement planning look pathetically modest. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that makes expensive real estate look even more impressive. I was standing on the front steps of the Whitmore estate, my estate now, watching a crew of professional movers unload furniture from trucks while David drove past on his way to work. The timing was perfect. He had to pass my new house to reach the highway, which meant he would witness my moving day twice daily for the rest of his working life. But this particular morning was special because he didn't yet know that the mansion he'd been admiring for years had just been purchased by the mother he'd assumed was too poor and frail to live independently. I had strategically positioned myself on the front steps, wearing my best dress and pearls, to ensure maximum visibility when David's car made its usual commute past his dream house. The expression on his face when he realized who was moving into the neighborhood's most expensive property would be worth every penny of the purchase price. But what happened next exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. David's car slowed as he approached the estate, probably wondering which wealthy family was moving into the house he'd coveted for so long. Then he saw me standing on the steps, directing the placement of furniture with the authority of someone who owned the property. The car stopped completely. David got out and walked toward me with the confused expression of someone trying to process information that didn't match his expectation. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "Good morning, David. I'm moving into my new house. What do you think of it?" "Your new house?" He looked around at the mansion, the grounds, the moving trucks filled with expensive furniture. "Mom, what's going on?" "I decided you were right about needing a change of housing. So I bought the Whitmore estate. We closed on Friday, the same day my old house sold." David's face went through several expressions as he tried to reconcile his assumptions about my finances with the evidence of a $3.2 million cash purchase. "Mom, where did you get the money for this?" "From my investments, sweetheart. The same investments I've been managing successfully for the past 20 years while you've been worried about my competence." "But the house we just sold, you said that was most of your assets." "Actually, David, I said no such thing. You assumed that was most of my assets. There's a significant difference between what someone assumes and what they actually know." But what I revealed next was what truly devastated him. The house you sold for $370,000 represented approximately 8% of my net worth. This house cost me $3.2 million, which represents about 60% of my liquid assets. The mathematics were sinking in. If 60% of my liquid assets equaled $3.2 million, and my liquid assets were only a portion of my total net worth, then David had been managing the finances of someone considerably wealthier than he had ever imagined. "Mom, why didn't you tell me about your financial situation?" "Because you never asked about my actual finances, David. You simply assumed that because I was 78, I must be poor and incompetent. You made major decisions about my life based on assumptions rather than information." A neighbor walking her dog had stopped to watch this conversation, clearly fascinated by the family drama unfolding on the front steps of the neighborhood's most expensive house. "But if you could afford this house, why did you let me sell your old house?" "Because you convinced me to sign a power of attorney, then used it to make decisions I didn't agree with. I wanted to see what you would do with legal authority over someone you thought was helpless." "Mom, I was trying to help you." "No, David, you were trying to manage me. There's a difference between helping someone and controlling someone, and you chose control." But what happened next was what made the entire conversation worth having in such a public setting. David's wife Jennifer appeared, having apparently received a phone call about her husband's unusual behavior. When she saw me standing in front of the Whitmore estate, her confusion was even more visible than David's had been. "Betty, what are you doing here? Aren't you supposed to be moving into Sunset Gardens today?" "Change of plans, Jennifer. I bought this house instead." Jennifer looked at the mansion, then at me, then at David. "You bought the Whitmore estate? How?" "With money, dear. The same money David has been managing so efficiently through his power of attorney." The irony was beautiful. David had used his legal authority to sell my house because he thought I needed the money for assisted living. Instead, I had used the proceeds as pocket change for a real estate purchase that demonstrated exactly how unnecessary his management had been. David, Jennifer said slowly. If your mother could afford to buy this house, why did you sell her old house? That was the question David couldn't answer without admitting that he had made major financial decisions based on assumptions about my competence and assets, rather than actual knowledge of my situation. I was trying to simplify her financial situation. You were trying to control her financial situation, I corrected gently. And in doing so, you've learned that your assumptions about my competence were as inaccurate as your assumptions about my wealth. But the most satisfying moment was still to come. Mrs. Patterson from across the street had walked over to congratulate me on my new home purchase. Betty, this is wonderful. I had no idea you were looking at houses in the neighborhood. It was a recent decision, Mrs. Patterson. My son convinced me that I needed a change of housing, and he was absolutely right. David was standing there listening to his mother being congratulated by neighbors for a real estate purchase that cost more than he made in 5 years, purchased with wealth he hadn't known existed, in response to his own recommendations about her housing needs. The woman he thought was too frail to live independently had just become the wealthiest homeowner on the block. And the financial decisions he thought he was managing had been revealed as amateur hour compared to the investment acumen that had made such a purchase possible. As David drove away to work that morning, he was learning that assumptions about aging, competence, and family finances can be the most expensive mistakes anyone ever makes. 2 weeks later, I hosted a housewarming party that served multiple purposes, celebrating my new home, introducing myself to the neighborhood, and providing David with a comprehensive education about the difference between assumed poverty and actual wealth. The guest list included neighbors, friends from my various clubs and volunteer activities, my financial advisor Margaret Chen, and my family, who were all still processing the revelation that their frail relative had purchased the neighborhood's most expensive house with what appeared to be pocket money. But what made the evening particularly educational was the presence of several local business leaders who had been my investment partners for years, people David had never met despite their significant role in building the wealth he had assumed didn't exist. Betty, this house is absolutely magnificent, said Robert Morrison, the CEO of Morrison Holdings, where I had been a silent partner for 15 years. You've created a beautiful home here. David, who was standing nearby nursing a drink and trying to process the evening's revelations, looked confused by Robert's familiarity with my real estate decisions. Robert and I have been business associates for years, I explained to David. He's helped me diversify my investment portfolio considerably. Business associates? David repeated slowly. Mom, what kind of business associates? The profitable kind, sweetheart. Robert's company has provided me with excellent returns on several commercial real estate ventures. Margaret Chen joined our conversation, carrying a folder that she handed to me with a smile. Betty, here are the quarterly reports you requested. Your portfolio performed exceptionally well this quarter. Quarterly reports? David was beginning to sound like a man discovering that everything he thought he knew about his mother was incorrect. I review my investment performance every quarter, David. It's important to stay informed about your financial situation, don't you think? But what happened next was what really demonstrated the scope of David's miscalculations. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the president of the local community foundation, approached with obvious enthusiasm. Betty, I wanted to thank you again for your generous donation to our scholarship fund. $50,000 will help so many deserving students. $50,000? David's voice had risen enough to attract attention from other guests. It's an annual donation, David. I've been supporting educational scholarships for over a decade. Annual? He was doing mental mathematics that clearly weren't adding up to his assumptions about my financial limitations. Education is important to me, sweetheart. I believe in investing in young people's futures. The conversation was interrupted by James Peterson, my accountant, who had arrived fashionably late with his wife. Betty, congratulations on the new house. The tax implications of the purchase were quite favorable, given your overall financial structure. Tax implications. David was beginning to sound like a broken record. James has been helping me optimize my tax strategy for years, David. It's amazing how much money you can save with proper planning. Mom, exactly how much money are we talking about here? The question he should have asked before assuming authority over my finances, but the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of my attorney, who had news that would make David's evening even more educational. Betty, I have those documents you requested, Margaret said, pulling out a legal folder. The revised power of attorney is ready for your signature. Revised power of attorney? Yes, David. I've decided to revoke the power of attorney you convinced me to sign. It's become clear that your assumptions about my competence and finances were inadequate for the responsibilities you assumed. The legal document that had given David authority over my decisions was about to be revoked by the same incompetent woman who had just demonstrated superior financial judgment by purchasing a mansion while he sold her house for what amounted to pocket change. But what I announced next was what made the entire evening worthwhile. I've also decided to establish a trust fund for my grandchildren's education. With Margaret as the trustee, David, your children will have their college expenses fully funded, but the money will be managed by someone who understands the difference between wealth preservation and wealth assumption. David was staring at me with the expression of someone who had spent weeks congratulating himself on efficiently managing his mother's transition to poverty, only to discover that she was wealthy enough to fund his children's education as an afterthought. Mom, I don't understand. If you had this much money, why didn't you tell me? Because you never asked, David. You simply assumed that I was poor and incompetent, then used those assumptions to justify taking control of my life. But I was trying to help. You were trying to manage. And in the process, you've learned that managing someone requires understanding their actual situation, not just assuming their limitations. The party continued until nearly midnight, with David spending the evening being introduced to business associates, investment partners, and financial advisors that his frail mother had been working with successfully for years. Every conversation revealed another aspect of the sophisticated financial life he had assumed didn't exist. By the time the guests departed, David had received a comprehensive education in the difference between apparent vulnerability and actual competence, between assumed poverty and careful wealth management, and between helping someone and controlling someone. But the most important lesson was still to come. The morning after my housewarming party, David arrived at my new mansion with the chastened expression of someone who had spent the night reconsidering everything he thought he knew about his mother's competence, wealth, and need for management. Mom, we need to talk. I invited him into the sunroom, where we sat surrounded by the kind of luxury that his assumptions about my poverty had deemed impossible. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. David, what would you like to discuss? I think I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. For what specifically? For assuming that you were incompetent to manage your own affairs. For selling your house without properly understanding your financial situation. For treating you like you were helpless when you were actually more financially sophisticated than I am. It was a start, but I wanted to make sure David understood the full scope of what he had learned. And what else? For using the power of attorney to override your preferences instead of respecting your autonomy. For assuming that age automatically equals incompetence. For trying to manage you instead of supporting you. And what have you learned about assumptions and family relationships? David was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with insights that challenged fundamental beliefs about aging, competence, and his role as a protective son. I've learned that my assumptions about aging were based on fear, rather than evidence. I was so worried about you becoming vulnerable that I started treating you as if you were already vulnerable. And what about the financial aspects of this situation? I've learned that wealth and competence don't automatically decline with age, and that assuming someone is poor because they're elderly is both arrogant and dangerous. But what he said next was what convinced me that he had genuinely learned from this experience. Mom, I've also learned that trying to protect someone by controlling them isn't protection at all, it's patronizing. You didn't need my management. You needed my respect. And going forward, I want to understand your actual situation, instead of making assumptions about it. I want to support your decisions instead of overriding them. And I want to learn from your financial expertise instead of assuming you lack it. The conversation was interrupted by a phone call from the real estate agent who had handled my mansion purchase. When I answered, she had news that would provide David with one final lesson about assumptions and reality. Mrs. Morrison, I have wonderful news. The Whitmore estate has already appreciated in value since your purchase. Based on recent comparable sales, your house is now worth approximately $3.8 million. I had made $600,000 in unrealized gains in 2 weeks, simply by purchasing a house that David had assumed I couldn't afford. Thank you for the update, Sarah. It's always nice to know that good real estate decisions continue to pay dividends. When I hung up, David was staring at me with a mixture of admiration and embarrassment. Mom, you made more money in 2 weeks of homeownership than I make in 5 years of salary. Real estate can be an excellent investment, David, when you have the resources and knowledge to make good decisions. And you've had those resources and knowledge all along. Yes, I have. The question is why you assumed I didn't. David was quiet for several minutes, clearly processing the implications of everything he had learned about assumptions, competence, and the relationship between age and capability. But what he said next was what proved he had genuinely learned from this experience. Mom, I think I assumed you didn't have resources and knowledge because I was afraid of what it would mean if you did. What do you mean? If you were competent and wealthy and capable of making your own decisions, then my role as your protective son became less important. I think I was trying to create a situation where you needed me, rather than accepting a relationship where you simply wanted me in your life. The insight was more profound than I had expected. David had recognized that his attempts to manage me were as much about his own needs as they were about his perceptions of mine. And how do you feel about a relationship where I want you in my life, rather than needing your management? Honestly, it's scarier because it means you could choose not to have me in your life if I behave badly. But it's also more honest, because it's based on mutual respect rather than assumed dependency. David, I want you in my life. I always have. But I want you here as my son, not as my manager. I understand that now, Mom. And I'm grateful that you taught me the lesson in a way that was educational rather than just punitive. What do you mean? You could have simply told me I was wrong about your finances. Instead, you demonstrated that I was wrong in a way that taught me about assumptions, respect, and the difference between helping and controlling. As David prepared to leave that morning, he paused at the front door of the mansion that represented everything he had learned about assumptions and reality. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. When you bought this house, were you trying to teach me a lesson, or were you just tired of being managed? Both, sweetheart. I was tired of being managed, and I wanted to teach you that management wasn't necessary. This house is proof that your assumptions about my frailty and poverty were incorrect. But more importantly, it's proof that I'm still capable of making excellent decisions about my own life. And the lesson is that I should trust your judgment rather than assuming you lack it. The lesson is that competence doesn't automatically decline with age, and that love means supporting someone's autonomy rather than eliminating it. But what happened next would prove that David had truly learned from this expensive education in assumptions and reality. 6 months after David's education in assumptions and financial reality, the changes in our family dynamic had become both profound and permanent. But more importantly, the lessons he learned had started influencing how he approached aging and competence in all areas of his life. The most visible change was in how David interacted with me as a homeowner and investor. Instead of trying to manage my decisions, he started asking for my advice about his own financial choices. Mom, Jennifer and I are thinking about refinancing our mortgage. Given your real estate experience, what do you think about current interest rates? My real estate experience. 6 months earlier, David had assumed I was too incompetent to own property. Now he was seeking my guidance about his own real estate decisions. I think you should wait another 3 months, sweetheart. I believe rates will drop further, and the savings over the life of your loan could be substantial. How can you be sure about interest rate trends? I can't be sure, David, but I've been watching real estate markets for decades, and I have access to economic analysis that suggests rates haven't bottomed out yet. The conversation that would have been impossible 6 months earlier, David seeking financial advice from the mother he had assumed was financially incompetent, had become routine. But the most significant change was in how David now approached other elderly people in his professional and personal life. David worked as a manager at a technology company, where he supervised several employees approaching retirement age. Before his education in assumptions about aging, he had unconsciously begun managing these employees as if their age automatically predicted declining performance. Mom, I need to tell you about something that happened at work this week. What's that? One of my employees, Margaret, is 68 and has been with the company for 15 years. I've been gradually reducing her responsibilities because I assumed she was becoming less capable with age. And what happened? This week she presented a project proposal that was more innovative and comprehensive than anything the younger employees had developed. I realized I'd been managing her based on assumptions about aging rather than evidence about her actual performance. What did you do? I apologized to her and asked if she'd be interested in leading the new initiative. She's now heading a team that includes people half her age and her experience is proving invaluable. David had learned to apply the lessons from our housing situation to other relationships, recognizing that assumptions about aging can be limiting and inaccurate regardless of the context. But what happened next was what proved the transformation was genuine, rather than just convenient. David called me one evening with news that would demonstrate how completely his perspective on aging and competence had changed. "Mom, I have something to tell you about Dad." My late husband's father, David's grandfather, was 85 and had been living alone since his wife died 3 years earlier. David and I had been discussing whether he needed more support or supervision. "What about Grandpa? We've been assuming he needs help because he's 85, but I realized we were making the same assumptions about him that I made about you. So instead of planning his care, I asked him about his actual needs and preferences." "And what did you discover?" "That he's been managing his finances expertly, maintaining his house beautifully, and has a more active social life than most people my age. He doesn't need management, he needs respect for his continued competence." David had recognized that the tendency to assume aging equals incompetence wasn't limited to our situation, and he had started approaching all elderly people with the same respect for autonomy that he had learned to show me. "What are you going to do differently?" "Instead of planning what we think he needs, we're asking what he actually wants. And instead of assuming he's becoming incompetent, we're supporting his continued independence." The ripple effects of David's education continued to spread through his understanding of aging, family relationships, and professional interactions. But the most meaningful change was in our relationship itself. "Mom, I need to thank you for something." "What's that, sweetheart?" "For teaching me the difference between helping and controlling, for showing me that love means supporting someone's choices rather than overriding them, and for proving that competence and wisdom often increase with age rather than decrease." "You're welcome, David. But more importantly, you learned those lessons and applied them to other relationships. That's what makes the education valuable. I've been thinking about that night at your housewarming party when I met all your business associates and investment partners. I realized I had never bothered to learn about your professional life because I assumed it didn't exist. And now I understand that you've built a sophisticated network of professional relationships over decades, and that your financial success isn't luck or inheritance, it's the result of excellent decision-making and strategic thinking. The mansion that David had initially seen as evidence of mysterious wealth had become a symbol of the competence and expertise he had failed to recognize in his own mother. "David, what's the most important thing you've learned from this experience?" "That assumptions about aging can become self-fulfilling prophecies if we accept them uncritically. If we tell elderly people they're incompetent, many of them will start behaving as if they are. But if we expect continued competence and support continued growth, people often exceed our expectations." "And how has that changed your own relationship with aging?" "I used to be afraid of getting older because I thought it meant inevitable decline. Now I see aging as an opportunity to accumulate wisdom, experience, and competence that younger people often lack." As we sat in the sunroom of the mansion that had taught my son so much about assumptions and reality, I reflected on how a simple real estate transaction had transformed our understanding of aging, family relationships, and the difference between love and control. David's attempt to manage my housing situation had backfired spectacularly, but it had also provided him with an education that would influence every subsequent relationship he had with aging people, including his future relationship with his own aging process. The power of attorney that was supposed to protect me from poor financial decisions had instead protected him from a lifetime of making assumptions about competence based on chronological age rather than evidence of actual ability. And the mansion that he now drove past twice daily served as a permanent reminder that wealth, wisdom, and competence don't automatically decline with age. They often improve, especially when they're supported by respect rather than restricted by assumptions. The woman he thought was too frail to live independently had become his teacher about aging, autonomy, and the relationship between love and control. And the lesson would last for the rest of his life, influencing every interaction he had with elderly people, and ultimately changing how he approached his own aging process. Sometimes the most expensive education is also the most valuable, and sometimes the best way to teach someone about respect is to demonstrate competence so clearly that assumptions become impossible to maintain. David had learned both lessons thoroughly, and our relationship had become stronger for the education, even if it had cost him the embarrassment of discovering that his mother was considerably wealthier and more competent than he had ever imagined. The final validation came a year later, when David was promoted to senior management at his company, partly based on his innovative approach to managing older employees and his recognition that experience often brings advantages that youth cannot match. Mom, I got the promotion. Congratulations, sweetheart. What do you think made the difference? Honestly, learning to value experience over assumptions. The insights I gained from our housing situation changed how I approach team management, and my supervisors noticed the improvement in productivity and morale. David had turned his expensive lesson in assumptions about aging into professional advancement, proving that the education I had provided was valuable far beyond our family dynamics. And what about your own future planning? I've stopped seeing retirement as the beginning of decline and started seeing it as the beginning of a new phase where I can apply decades of accumulated knowledge. I'm already planning consulting opportunities and investment strategies for my later years. The transformation was complete. The son who had tried to manage his mother's transition to dependency had learned to approach his own aging as an opportunity for continued growth and contribution. As I sat in my beautiful mansion, surrounded by the evidence of financial competence that David had never bothered to investigate before assuming control of my life, I realized that the most valuable inheritance I could leave him wasn't money. It was the understanding that aging brings wisdom, not just wrinkles, and that respect for elderly competence creates better outcomes for everyone involved. The house he had sold to protect me had been replaced by a mansion that protected something far more valuable: the recognition that assumptions about aging can be more limiting than aging itself, and that the best way to honor elderly people is to expect continued excellence rather than manage assumed decline. Some lessons are learned through instruction. The most important ones are learned through experience that's too expensive to ignore and too clear to misinterpret. David had received both, and he would carry those lessons forward into every subsequent interaction with aging people, including, eventually, his own aging process. The power of attorney that was supposed to protect me from my own poor judgment had instead protected him from a lifetime of poor assumptions about the relationship between age and competence. And every time he drove past the mansion that had cost him his misconceptions about his mother's capabilities, he was reminded that the most dangerous assumption anyone can make is that growing older automatically means growing less capable. The woman he thought needed management had taught him that what elderly people often need most is not supervision, but recognition of the wisdom and competence they've spent a lifetime developing. It was the most expensive lesson he ever learned, but also the most valuable, and it ensured that he would never again confuse chronological age with actual competence or mistake protective impulses for genuine respect. The mansion stood as permanent proof that frailty and poverty are indeed two very different things, and that assumptions about either one can be far more limiting than the realities they're supposed to address.